It's on his face.
You get to kind of just shut up.
How many times did you slap him?
I feel like Brian never thought that he was going to be enough.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Brian Entin's visit to the Merry Piglets in Jackson, Wyoming has revealed a completely different narrative to the one we've heard thus far. You may recall that the couple were at the restaurant on August 27th, the last day Gabby was seen alive. Also worth noting, there was CCTV footage of Brian and Gabby's visit, but it's been deleted. In this episode, I'm going to take you through the Merry Piglet shocker, a new story that has emerged. I'm going to take you through 4 or 5 separate points. But before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. So this information came through in what was sort of a special report from News Nation Prime. It was titled Getting Answers, Gabby's Final Days, and I'll put a link to that in the description. If you actually want to watch it firsthand, it's from about 13 minutes 13 seconds, and it's a clip of about 1 or 2 minutes where Brian Entin explains what happens at the Merry Piglets. I'm going to provide a summary with a bit of analysis and interpretation regarding that. So we start off with the first point that is raised, is that Gabby and Brian actually left the restaurant without paying. That's according to the manager. The first thing I want to emphasize is that Brian doesn't appear to be the aggressor in this version of the story. Of course, we also don't know whether there was a legitimate grievance against the food, the service, the bill, or some combination of the three. You know, if there is a legitimate grievance, one can actually imagine that there was some justification. But because we don't, it seems it doesn't seem right. It seems unjustifiable, right? What we do know is that the Merry Piglets incident was preceded by the Moab incident by 15 days, almost 2 weeks, where the couple could also be said to be behaving erratically, depending on the point of view that you take. What I'm trying to get at is that there's a certain amount of uncertainty about exactly what happened, about reality, what actually took place at the Merry Piglets incident. And I think what happened during the Moab incident provides some context, some color, some insight, perhaps into what happened around about 2 weeks and 1 day later. The second thing to emphasize is that arguably Gabby and Brian were breaking the law once again in Wyoming. You can't eat a meal and then leave without paying. So if we take the Moab incident into account, one could theoretically in that case say that the law that was broken or transgressed was perhaps speeding, driving recklessly, assault, and perhaps even obstruction of justice, in the sense of not stopping when it was clear they were being pursued by law enforcement, right? So if you take that psychology into the Merry Piglets, well, what do you get? So I think the third thing is this idea of doing something and then running away, right? Doing something, getting something, and then running away without paying the price. And certainly from Brian's perspective, isn't this an echo? I mean, it appears to be an echo for what Brian did. Didn't Brian do something and then ran away? It's obviously not clear who instigated the walkout of the restaurant. It's not clear whose idea that was. But what is clear is the opprobrium. This is once again a drama that took place with this particular couple on their journey. What was going on there? That brings us to the second point. They paid outside the restaurant. So regardless of whatever happened before, the bottom line is that apparently the bill was settled, the bill was paid. So regardless of whatever, did they break the law? No, because they ultimately squared the bill. But what we have here is once again someone pursuing the couple, and then when confronted, they did what was required. Similar again to the Moab incident. So with the Merry Piglets, the waitress followed the couple outside of the restaurant, and that was where they apparently paid, right? Now, another possibility is that Gabby wanted Brian to pay, and Brian either wouldn't pay or couldn't pay. Or Brian wasn't happy with something, Brian wasn't happy with the meal. And so Gabby was then upset. So you could have a situation like that as well. But the bottom line is that the couple did settle their bill, one assumes, in full. I think one has to also speculate whether the couple reneged completely on their bill. Did they not pay any of their bill, or did they just pay part of it, and that is left out of the story? And perhaps they didn't pay a tip, and that is why the waitress pursued them. And perhaps Gabby felt that the waitress didn't deserve a tip, and maybe she didn't. So we don't know 100% whether they paid their bill completely before walking out, or whether they only paid a portion of it, or whether they paid none of it, or whether they left out the tip, or whether the tip wasn't sufficient. We don't know, which of those possibilities is reality. The third thing, which I think is quite interesting, is the manager countering the impression we've had so far of Brian as a volatile, emotional person. We've heard that from a couple of people. And instead she says Brian was very calm. So throughout all of this, Brian was calm. She doesn't say much about Gabby, but that Brian was very calm. It doesn't say that Gabby was very calm. According to the manager of the Merry Piglets, speaking anonymously and off camera, there was no scene, no loud voices, and no one getting angry. In a scenario where a service is provided and customers don't want to pay for it and walk out, I don't know, it's difficult to believe that no one got angry. Didn't the waitress who pursued the couple get angry she wasn't paid? I would have gotten angry. Another possibility, of course, is that it was all an innocent mistake, and the couple simply forgot to pay, walked out, and when confronted simply paid what they were owed. You could also have had Gabby assuming Brian paid, or Brian assuming Gabby paid, or something like that. Some kind of innocent mistake, something that is confusing. But this quote-unquote innocent scenario might have been plausible, except for this fourth and final point, and that is Gabby returned to the restaurant with Brian wanting her money back. So once again, in their version of events, Gabby's sort of the aggressor. Gabby returns to the restaurant, Brian kind of accompanies her, and Gabby's the one wanting her money back, not Brian. Brian just seems to be a sort of appendage who doesn't say anything, almost like he was during the Moab incident, sort of just hanging around while Gabby says everything and is assertive. So, and that's according to this version. Gabby said she wanted her money back. In this story, Gabby seems to be emotional and the aggressor, but I think an important clue is hidden in the fabric here, and it's important not to miss it. Why is Gabby wanting her money back and not Brian's? Why is Gabby paying for lunch and not Brian? And so it is possible that some of the big problems between the couple was money and also who was paying for everything. It's frustrating as an investigator of this case having these murky, somewhat unreliable versions of events, for example, at the Merry Piglets. But I have to say, it's become part and parcel of true crime. Even those focused on this case, even those who are communicating to us about this case, seem to want to see how they can wag the dog. Reality be damned. And lately there's been news about ex-girlfriends and so on, and a lot of people in the public are also trying to opportunistically add stories and versions of events that don't seem to be reliable at all. This is the society that we live in. You can conjure a story, and if you get enough attention, well, that's your reward. Who cares if it's true or not? And I think that tells you the world that we're living in. and you're not paying your bill, you're not paying the price, you don't care about reality. If we accept that something happened at Merry Piglets where Brian or Gabby were out of line, it does call into question both his and her attitudes to what Brian described as human infestation. It's not clear how much Gabby subscribed to the same seditious view, but if society was regarded with contempt, then one can imagine them treating certain people with contempt. If you've got that view, if you've been reading Fight Club and whatever, and you've kind of got this sneering view of people, well, then it might actually express itself in certain ways, in certain instances, right? I'm not saying it did. I'm just asking the question. And that then brings us to the final thing I want to deal with, which is the aftermath. If we take this new version of events, how might it have affected the aftermath? What happened to Brian and Gabby once they left the restaurant? What was the vibe in the van? What was the vibe at camp? What was it like that night when they were, having dinner or whatever? What feelings did they take, negative or positive, to Spread Creek Camp? Again, I don't know how much credibility we ought to put on this version of events or the one by other witnesses, quite frankly. Possibly both form different halves of a whole truth that is yet to be revealed. But if there is some truth to the scenario, how could events have played out back at the Spread Creek Camp? Does it matter if Brian was the aggressor or if Gabby was? Taking someone's life is unacceptable no matter what. So does it really matter which one was the aggressor? Even so, we are interested in the dynamic as it was and how it played out. That is what true crime is all about. What actually happened? What were the underlying dynamics that drove something to its inevitable conclusion? So I wonder whether it wasn't a carbon copy of what happened outside the Moonflower Co-op in Moab. In other words, perhaps Gabby was stressed about something, perhaps she was stressed about money, perhaps she was anxious, and perhaps similar to that incident, Brian started off calm. Brian started off in a normal demeanor and then grew more and more desperate in his attempt to control Gabby, and perhaps that led to him having some kind of episode. Gabby perhaps raised her voice in this peaceful Camp Creek sort of area. Perhaps she became even more emotional, defending her conduct at the Merry Piglets and perhaps blaming him for not taking her side or whatever. And then Brian perhaps eventually lost his cool, and perhaps it escalated to a full-blown argument. Out in the tent, across the creek, alone, there was no way to shut himself up in the van or shut her out. And you remember what she said? He kept telling me to shut up. And, if there's no way to shut himself in the van or shut her out, well, what about if he potentially took matters into his own hands? What if he wanted to shut her up in a different way? What do you think? Does that make sense? Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.